What does it mean when the stories we tell ourselves no longer match the horrors we live through? I don't know why I said it. It wasn't planned. No one had asked me anything. I wasn't answering a question or trying to be profound. I think my mouth just moved on its own, like my body was trying to flush out something my soul couldn't carry anymore. I remember the room falling quiet in that strange way, not total silence, but that uneasy stillness where everything seems to pause just enough for a few seconds to stretch out into eternity. I was still in my gear. My vest hadn't come off. My helmet was hanging from my knee, and the sweat had long dried to salt across the back of my neck. The others were strewn around the room, half limp, half alert, in that exhausted state we always came back in after patrol. One guy was eating cold beans straight out of the can, another was lying back with his arm across his eyes, pretending to sleep. The humming light above us flickered and buzzed, as if it too were straining under the weight of the day. I had just come back from a 9-hour rotation through the outer village, Sector 7, though no one called it that anymore. It had a name once, before we arrived and mapped it out in grids and target zones. Now it was just a husk. A place with shadows that moved and eyes that watched you from broken windows. We walked the same dusty path we always did, past homes with sandbags instead of front doors, and kids who stopped smiling a long time ago. The air smelled like burnt metal and tension. My boots kicked up that same rust-colored dust, coating everything in the same uniform shade of death. That afternoon, something had gone wrong, again. A comms failure, a misread signal, a rumor turned into action. A shot was fired. Then 5 more. Then chaos. I couldn't even tell you who started it. When it was over, there were bodies. Civilians. Probably. Hard to say. One of them had a radio, one of those cheap ones you can buy in a bazaar for a few rupees. That was enough. We didn't even look each other in the eye afterward. I hadn't taken off my gloves. They were stained with blood that had already begun to darken, seeping deep into the creases in the leather. My fingers twitched now and then, like they were trying to peel themselves out of my own skin. I just sat there on the edge of my bunk, rifle across my lap, feeling like I was made of glass, thin, brittle, and one wrong breath away from shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. My mind kept flashing back to the last face I saw before we pulled out. A man, older, maybe 50, with gray in his beard and tears in his eyes. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening. He was just looking at us, standing over the limp body of a girl no older than 10. His mouth moved, but I couldn't hear the words. I still don't know if he was praying or cursing us. And then, back in the barracks, surrounded by the tired, the wounded, the emotionally bankrupt, I said it. I said, what does it mean when the stories we tell ourselves no longer match the horrors we live through? A couple of guys glanced over, more annoyed than curious. Thompson looked up from his beans for a second and grunted something about me going all poet mode again. Someone else, I think Davis, chuckled and tossed a half-empty bottle of water my way. Drink up, he said. You're getting dramatic. I caught the bottle without looking at him. I didn't reply. Not because I was offended. Because I didn't have the energy to explain that it wasn't drama. It was rot. Rot in the mind. Something had gone sour inside me. Something had cracked. We all knew it. All of us had it in some form or another. Some dealt with it by cracking jokes. Others drank it away. Some wrote letters home that they'd never send. But none of us ever said it aloud. We didn't talk about how the story we were trained to believe, the good guys versus bad guys, the democracy spreaders, the noble warriors, was falling apart with every trigger we pulled. Every enemy who turned out to be a father. Every suspect who bled like a human being. We buried that truth under duty, under routine, under silence. But not that night. That night, the words came out, and for a second, I think they landed. I think they lingered in the air, uncomfortable and unwelcome, like a ghost no one wanted to admit they saw. After a minute, the room slipped back into its usual rhythm. Someone turned up the volume on the radio. A few guys started laughing about something that happened during the morning's briefing, some officer mispronouncing a village name. The moment passed, but I couldn't let go of the question. I leaned back on my bunk and stared at the ceiling, feeling the stiffness in my knees and the ache in my shoulders. The light above buzzed louder, like it was trying to drown out the noise in my head. I stared so long I could almost see through the concrete. I saw the first base I was ever deployed to. The sand, the fences, the sunrise behind the radio towers. The moment I first stepped off the plane, full of naive purpose and unearned pride. I saw the beginning of it all, and I felt the weight of what came after rushing toward me like a freight train. That question, what does it mean? It wasn't just a thought. It was a crack in the dam. And I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't find the answer in some textbook, or from a commanding officer, or even from the guys beside me. I'd have to go back. I'd have to walk through every moment I tried to forget. And maybe, just maybe, I could stitch the story back together, not the one we were told to tell, but the one that actually happened. Because until then, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't exist in peace. And that's where the Raoul story begins. Not with glory, not with medals or honor, but with silence. A silence so heavy it cracks open and out spills the truth we buried. This is not the story I was trained to tell. This is the one I lived. I was 22 when I first arrived in the desert, full of conviction and ideas that didn't belong to me. My boots were still too new, creasing for the first time against the heat-baked earth as we descended the ramp of the C-130, swallowed instantly by air so hot and dry it felt like opening an oven door and stepping inside. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times, me walking into the war zone, rifle at the ready, sun behind my back like a halo, my jaw clenched with purpose. But the reality was far less cinematic. My gear felt heavier than it had during training. The dust clawed into my throat with every breath. And the silence of that foreign land wasn't noble, it was hollow and waiting. A silence that pressed in on your ears and your bones. There were no crowds cheering, no villagers offering flowers. Just cracked earth, distant gunfire, and the hum of helicopters fading into the sky. We were stationed at a forward operating base about 20 clicks from the nearest town, a cluster of sand-colored tents, shipping containers, and radio towers patched together like a forgotten outpost on Mars. The base itself had no identity. It was temporary. Everything was temporary. Supplies, orders, even us. Our presence, though massive in its footprint, always felt like something fragile. I remember the first time I watched the sun rise behind the wire. The shadows of the guard towers stretched across the dirt like fingers. It was beautiful in a way I didn't expect, tragic, quiet, endless. For a moment, I thought maybe I was part of something eternal. That illusion didn't last. During our first briefing, we were told we had entered an evolving situation. The insurgency, we were told, was fractured and desperate. Their tactics had grown erratic. Improvised explosives were now being packed into soda cans and pressure cookers, hidden inside donkey carts, even buried beneath the dusty roads we walked. Civilians, we were warned, were not always what they appeared. They could be scouts, couriers, human shields. Trust no one was the quiet subtext of every map and intelligence slide. And yet, we were also tasked with rebuilding the area, winning trust, restoring basic services, facilitating democracy. The contradiction was never addressed. We were there to help, and also to kill. It didn't make sense, not really, but it wasn't supposed to. We were told to follow orders and not ask questions. The ones who asked too many didn't last long. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, checking weapons, memorizing call signs and patrol routes. We were briefed on cultural awareness, told not to point with our left hands, not to stare at women, not to step on prayer mats. We learned basic greetings in the local language, though most of our attempts earned confused stares or stony silence from the villagers. Still, I believed we were doing something good. We were a presence, a force of stability. Or so I thought. That belief clung to me like sweat under my body armor. It was something to hold on to when the heat made your vision ripple and your skin feel like it was boiling under Kevlar. Then came my first real mission. A routine patrol. That's what they called it. A hearts and minds operation. We were to walk through the market area in the town of Darrim, a place that had recently been swept for explosives. The roads were lined with bullet holes and shuttered shops. Graffiti in a language I couldn't read was splashed across cracked walls. Every alleyway looked like a trap. But I kept telling myself, this is what soldiers do. We show up. We offer security. We give candy to kids, smile at elders, ask questions through translators, and write reports that say things like, local sentiment is cautiously optimistic. But the people weren't optimistic. They were terrified. They watched us with wary eyes and tense shoulders. When we handed out small bags of rice and medical supplies, most took them in silence. One woman slapped the box from my hands and shouted something I didn't understand. Later, the translator told me she'd said, "You cannot buy back the dead." I didn't know what she meant. Not then. But I would. My first firefight happened not long after. I remember the exact moment. We were passing a seemingly abandoned courtyard when a shot cracked through the air, loud and sharp, like God snapping his fingers. It came from nowhere and everywhere. Chaos erupted. Shouts, screams, the metallic clatter of rifles swinging into position. My heart exploded in my chest. Time slowed, like in a bad dream. My mouth went dry, my fingers clumsy, but training kicked in like a second body taking over. I dropped to my knee behind a broken pillar, scanning for movement. My squad leader, Davis, was shouting commands, and I followed them without hearing them. It wasn't bravery. It was survival. It was muscle memory. The courtyard turned into a battlefield. Bullets pinged off stone. Dust rose in thick clouds. One of our guys, Jenkins, took a hit in the calf and went down, clutching his leg and shrieking. We returned fire, unloading rounds into windows, doorways, anything that looked like it might hold a threat. There was no time to confirm targets. We didn't ask questions. You fire where they fire from. That's the rule. Eventually, it stopped. The enemy was gone, or dead. I didn't know. My ears rang. My body buzzed with leftover adrenaline. The smell of gunpowder and burning hung in the air. Inside one of the buildings we cleared afterward, we found a body. He was young, 16, maybe 17. His rifle had jammed. There was blood on his chest and on the floor. I stared at him longer than I should have. His eyes were open, frozen in some mixture of pain and confusion, like even he didn't know how this had happened. He had a watch on his wrist, a cheap plastic thing with a cartoon character on it. Something a child might wear. I remember that watch more than his face. I remember thinking, this isn't what I was told it would be. Later, when we returned to base, our squad was debriefed. We were commended for rapid and effective engagement. Jenkins was medevaced and survived. The lieutenant handed us water bottles and said, "That's why we train like we do." Someone clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good, man. You held it together." I nodded, but I didn't feel anything. Not pride. Not shame. Just emptiness. I went back to my cot and sat there in the heat, staring at the rifle I had cleaned 100 times and now barely recognized. I wondered if the kid I shot had ever even held a real weapon before that day. I wondered what his name was. if his parents would ever find his body. I didn't write any of that in my report. None of us did. That night, as I lay in my cot listening to the distant thump of mortars and the soft snoring of the guys around me, I stared up at the canvas ceiling and realized something I never said out loud. I didn't know who we were really fighting. I didn't know what side I was on. I didn't know if the people who hated us were wrong to hate us. But I knew, deep in that raw, scraped place inside, that I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Whatever innocence I had when I arrived, whatever clean version of the story I'd carried with me, it was gone now. Not taken. Given away. And that was just the beginning. The days started bleeding into each other, not gradually, but like a switch had been thrown without warning. After that first firefight, the concept of time began to warp. Days felt endless, but weeks vanished in the blink of an eye. I'd wake up in a pool of sweat, muscles sore from armor that felt more like a second skin than protection. My rifle never left my side, even in sleep. I'd wake in the night gripping it across my chest like a lifeline, unsure if I had just come out of a nightmare or was still in one. Time became a carousel of patrols, briefings, gunfire, shouting, reports, and waiting. Always the waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for clearance. Waiting for the next explosion, the next mistake, the next face I'd have to forget. But what got to me more than the action was the language. The vocabulary of war. It crept into your brain like a vine, slow at first, then strangling. You start by using the terms out of necessity. Hostile targets. Civilian proximity. Force escalation. You don't question it because it's how everyone talks. It sounds official. It sounds like control. But what it really does is create distance, distance from the reality of what you're doing. You aren't shooting people anymore. You're neutralizing threats. You aren't occupying a neighborhood. You're stabilizing a zone. You aren't killing a man, you're engaging a high-value asset. The words wash over the violence like bleach over blood, sanitizing it for PowerPoints and press releases. And the worst part is, you start using it with yourself. You start believing it. Because if you don't, something inside you will crack wide open and never seal again. There was one day, it's burned into my mind, when this realization slammed into me with full force. It was late afternoon, maybe around 1600. The sun was beginning to lower just enough to stretch our shadows across the dirt roads like exhausted ghosts. We were on patrol in a contested district, a row of tight alleyways, goat pens, and stacked concrete homes with rusted doors and satellite dishes that looked more like shields than receivers. Our job was to provide overwatch for an intelligence sweep. Command believed a mid-tier insurgent commander had been seen ducking into one of the houses 2 nights prior. That was enough to mobilize an entire platoon. We moved through the alleyways in a diamond formation, our point man sweeping every doorway, every window, every pile of trash that might conceal a roadside bomb. The interpreter, Arif, a local who risked his life every day for us and was treated with quiet disdain by most of the unit, whispered to me that the village elder was requesting we not enter a particular home. The family inside had just buried someone, and it was seen as sacrilegious to disturb the house in mourning. I relayed that to our lieutenant, a fresh-faced officer out of ROTC who hadn't seen as much as a scraped knee in theater yet. He shrugged. "If they don't want us to go in," he said, "then that's probably where the guy is hiding." I remember that moment because something in my gut twisted. A wrongness. A warning. But I didn't protest. None of us did. We kicked the door in. The inside was dim, dusty. A woman screamed. Children cried. There was a low wailing sound coming from a room in the back, mourning, like Arif had said. We cleared the house, room by room, until we reached the source of the sound, a body laid out on a thin woven mat, wrapped in white cloth. An old man sat beside it, hands folded in prayer, rocking gently. He didn't even look up at us. The dead woman was maybe 30. Her face had been covered with a scarf, her hands folded over her chest. There were no weapons, no insurgents, just grief. The lieutenant called it in and then told us to wrap it up. He didn't apologize to the family. He didn't speak a single word to them. We filed out, boots crunching dirt, while the children stared at us with open hatred in their eyes. Not fear. Hatred. I felt it cling to my skin like a second uniform. When we returned to the FOB, the lieutenant filed the incident as intelligence discrepancy, no contact. That's what it said on the record. No mention of the prayers we interrupted. No mention of the terror. No mention of how I saw Arif's hands tremble when we walked out of that house, as if he'd just been the one to pull the trigger. That night I wrote in my journal, angrily, furiously. I wrote about the look in that old man's eyes, how he never flinched, never blinked, just kept rocking back and forth, whispering to a dead woman as we pointed rifles at him. I wrote about how easily we turned sacred moments into operational interference. How hollow the word intelligence sounded in a house filled with mourning. I ended the entry with a sentence I read over and over for days afterward. We don't belong here, and we never did. But the system doesn't care what you write in your journal. It cares about the story you present. And that story has to be clean, digestible. Us versus them. Progress. Stability. Victory. Any other version makes people nervous. Any other version invites questions. So we learned to speak the language. We learned to lie. The lies weren't even always malicious. Sometimes they were just omissions, gaps, edits. You'd leave a detail out of the report because you didn't want to explain it. You tell yourself it doesn't change the outcome or it's just noise. But those little edits pile up. They snowball into something grotesque. And eventually, you look back on the mission and realize you don't recognize the official version. The report says 0 civilian casualties. But you saw a woman limping, blood trailing behind her. The report says successful contact with local leaders, but you remember the shouting, the way one elder spat at your boots. The report says hostile engagement, but you remember the kid who ran because he was scared, not because he was aiming a weapon. That's when the doubt starts to creep in. Not a loud, overwhelming doubt. A quiet one. It sits in the back of your mind, whispering during the long hours of guard duty, or when you're cleaning your rifle for the 10th time that week. What if we're not the good guys? It asks. What if we're just one more armed force in a long line of armed forces who came here thinking they were different? I asked that question once, just once, out loud. We were sitting around a crate of MREs, trying to choke down tasteless beef stew while the wind kicked up sand that stuck to your tongue. I don't even remember the exact words I used, but I remember how quiet it got. Like I'd just said something obscene. One of the guys laughed and said I was getting soft. Another just looked away. It was understood, even without saying it, we don't talk about that. We can joke about dead bodies, about messed up patrols, about the food, about the smell, but not about the story. The story is sacred. The story keeps us sane. That's the real power of the lie. It isn't just to protect the command or justify the mission. It's to protect us from the weight of what we're doing. From the horror that, maybe, none of it makes sense. That maybe, the cost isn't worth it. That maybe, we become something we swore we'd never be. And so we repeat the story. Over and over. Until it becomes habit. Until it becomes survival. But I never could quite let it go. That whisper in the back of my mind. That journal under my pillow. The look in that farmer's eyes before Mendoza shot him. The woman mourning her daughter in the alleyway. The old man in prayer. All those fragments refuse to disappear, no matter how many hostile engagements I wrote up. No matter how many times I said, area secure. The truth was dying, and we were the ones digging the grave. One report at a time. That morning refused to die in my memory. Long after the war, long after I hung up the uniform and folded it into a box I'd never open again, that day lived on like something unfinished, an open wound that refused to scab over. Maybe it was because no bullets flew, no bombs fell, no blood was spilled, at least not visibly. But something inside me was wounded in a way I couldn't explain with scars or stories. It was the kind of pain you don't notice until you're sitting alone in a room years later, staring at a wall and realizing you're still waiting for someone to come help the boy you never looked for. We rolled out of the FOB before sunrise, and the horizon looked like it was smoldering. A thin line of orange glowed beneath the gray expanse of sky, like the world was being reheated from some previous apocalypse. I sat in the back of the Humvee, clutching my rifle across my lap like a crutch, pretending I was awake, pretending I was whole. None of us really talked anymore on convoys. In the beginning, we'd joke, trade stories, laugh nervously to keep the fear at bay. But by this point in the deployment, we'd all seen too much and said too little. Our silence was a pact, an unspoken agreement to hold in what we couldn't afford to share, not because we were ashamed, but because we were afraid if we started talking, we might never stop. And if we never stopped, we might see the full picture of what we had become. No one wanted that. The road to the refugee center cut through a valley littered with skeletal trees and husks of bombed-out vehicles. Every time we passed that stretch, it felt like driving through the aftermath of some forgotten myth. A landscape of ghosts. I used to wonder who had once driven those rusted trucks. What faces stared through those windshields when the fire came. And whether anyone still mourned them. Probably not. The dead don't leave names here. Just smoke and questions. That's another thing they don't teach you in basic. How many questions you'll bring home. How few answers. We arrived at the refugee compound just after 1100 hours. The air was hot, thick with flies and the scent of rot, disease, garbage, and old grief. The place wasn't really a compound, more like a last-ditch holding cell for the displaced. Children without shoes wandered aimlessly between tents. A woman stirred something in a pot over a trash fire. It smelled like desperation boiled down to its simplest form. And still, when they saw us, some of them smiled. Not all. Not many. But some. And that, in some sick way, made it harder. It would have been easier if they hated us. If they shouted and threw rocks like in other places. But those smiles, they were hollow, hopeful, the kind that begged you not to be the monsters the last uniformed men were. We offloaded the supplies in silence. Rice, water, antibiotics. Nothing that could change the world. Just enough to slow its collapse. The commander of the center, a thin man with sunburned skin and cracked lips, approached us with gratitude like a reflex. He offered us tea. Our lieutenant declined, as always. "Can't stay long," he said. "We've got another checkpoint sweep on the way back." It was always like that. Our presence had to remain a whisper, fleeting. Too long in one place made us a target. Too long in one place meant we'd have to see the consequences of what we weren't doing. But that's when the old man came. He emerged from the crowd like a shadow growing legs, stooped, silent, carrying something heavy in his face. I remember his eyes. I'll never forget them. Eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at us, each of us, one by one, like he was trying to find something lost. When he finally did speak, it was with a voice like wine through dead leaves. Now. Fragile. Desperate. He spoke to the interpreter, and the words came out halting, cracking. His son had been taken. 14 years old. Grabbed by masked men in the night. No demand. No reason. Just silence. They came in a black pickup, no license plate. Armed. One had an American patch. The old man didn't know what it meant. He begged us, please, search the Eastern Trail. That's where they went. He knew it. He could feel it in his bones. Please, just look. The lieutenant shook his head before the translation was even finished. We don't run search and rescues. Not without authorization. Too risky. We've got civilians with us. Tell him we're sorry. I turned to him. It's half a click away. We've got 10 minutes. We've got a mission, he said without looking at me. You want to go chasing ghosts and get IED'd, be my guest. But I'm not explaining that in the report. The interpreter told the old man. The old man bowed his head and nodded. Not in understanding. In surrender. Like something in him broke, again. You learn to recognize it, that moment when someone accepts the world will not help them. That no one is coming. And I just stood there. Rifle in hand. Helmet heavy on my head. I could feel the sweat sliding down my back, and I hated it. Hated how human I still felt while doing something inhuman. I watched the old man turn away, shuffle into the camp, and disappear behind the canvas folds of his tent like a ghost returning to its grave. On the drive back, no one spoke. The road stretched endlessly beneath us. Flat. Empty. The kind of emptiness that eats your thoughts if you let it. I kept glancing toward the East Trail, a narrow path barely wide enough for a pickup. I imagined a boy with his hands bound, stumbling through the dust. I imagined him crying for someone to come. And I imagined what it must have felt like when no one did. That night, I opened my journal. My hands were shaking. I wrote for an hour. 2. I don't remember what I wrote, only that it came out in one furious storm, pages scrawled in messy black lines, words scratched out and rewritten. All I know is that I ended it with the same line over and over again. We didn't even look. And maybe that's what haunts me the most about that day. That we could have looked. We had the firepower, the vehicles, the time. But we didn't. We were too busy being soldiers, following orders, protecting ourselves, keeping the lie alive. The lie that we were always doing everything we could, that we were always on the side of the good, that we were never the ones turning our backs on the helpless. I realized something important that day, though I wouldn't admit it to myself for a long time after. The truth doesn't always die with violence. Sometimes it dies in hesitation, in indifference, in the quiet decision not to care. And once you make that decision, once you let it in, it never really leaves you. It just waits, silently, for the next boy you don't look for, the next cry you ignore, the next page you refuse to write. And long after the guns go silent, that's the war that keeps on killing. By that point in the war, I'd stopped counting how many missions I'd been on. They all started to feel the same, land in the same boots, walk the same streets, sweat the same filth into your collar, and repeat the same lines you were told to say. Each operation, each patrol, blurred into the next like badly edited film reels, each with a different town name I'd forget, a different set of orders I'd pretend made sense, and a new set of faces, usually afraid, sometimes angry, always silent. But underneath that repetition, something more disturbing was happening. I was changing in ways I didn't notice until it was too late. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Like a leak in a pipe, dripping behind a wall you never check until the floor caves in. I started dreaming in code words. Possible contact. Target secured. Negative on visual. I'd wake up in the middle of the night gripping my rifle, heart racing, drenched in sweat, even when no alarm had sounded. Sometimes I'd see flashes, faces without names, places without coordinates. A mother screaming. A child running. A man collapsing in silence. I didn't talk about it. No one did. If you told someone you were having nightmares, they'd say, same. And that was the end of the conversation. No one wanted to dig too deep. We all feared what we'd find buried inside each other, especially in ourselves. The mission that finally broke the last of my illusions was another observe and report detail, which usually meant something far more volatile. It was late August, blisteringly hot, and the ground felt like it was radiating heat upward through the soles of my boots. We'd been sent to the edge of a small desert village to monitor suspected armed traffic. Same routine. Intel said there might be a local safe house, hidden stash, or a rogue cell operating nearby. It was always vague, always built around maybe and possibly, but we moved like it was gospel. We were supposed to keep our presence light, minimal contact. But orders and reality often didn't get along. The first sign something was wrong came from the air. There was a silence, but not the usual rural kind. This was different. The birds weren't singing, no dogs barking, no distant farm noise. Just dead stillness. That kind of unnatural quiet that made the skin on the back of your neck tighten. We approached slowly, fanned out, weapons ready but lowered. I was covering the left flank near a cluster of low stone huts when I heard a metallic clank, soft, like something being dropped. I raised my rifle and signaled the others. A boy emerged from the doorway of one of the huts. Maybe 9, 10 at most. No shoes. Just a tattered shirt with some cartoon faded on it and oversized pants tied at the waist with a rope. In his hands, he held a metal bowl. His hands shook, and I could see the whites of his eyes. I remember thinking he looked more like a ghost than a child, sunken cheeks, lips dry and cracked. Then from inside the house came a woman's voice, urgent but not panicked, calling his name. He froze. We froze. Our training screamed at us to assess the situation. Analyze. Is he bait? Is there a wire? Is this a distraction? All of that ran through my head in a split second. And yet, nothing happened. No bomb. No ambush. Just a hungry child with a bowl. The woman emerged next, her hands raised, voice trembling, speaking fast. Arif translated. Please, he thought you were bringing food. That was it. That was the crime. The misstep. The threat. A boy hungry enough to walk toward armed men in desert camouflage, holding a bowl like we were a food truck. Our lieutenant shouted at them, told them to stay inside, that it was dangerous out here, that we weren't there to help, and that they should know better. The woman apologized. The boy just stared. I lowered my rifle and looked away. I couldn't hold his gaze. When we returned to the FOB, the incident wasn't even logged. It didn't register. No shots fired, no intel gathered, no arrests made. But for me, it was the moment something snapped, because for the first time, I didn't feel anger, or grief, or even guilt. I felt nothing. That was what scared me most. I'd watched a starving child walk toward me like I was hope, and all I felt was tactical analysis. For those few seconds, I didn't see him as a boy. I saw him as a variable, a moving part, a risk profile. Later that night, I sat in the makeshift chapel we had built out of plywood and sandbags. It had no priest, no congregation, just a few broken benches and a wooden cross that someone had nailed together in boredom. I didn't go there to pray. I went there because it was the only place no one talked. No cards, no jokes, no gossip about home. Just silence. I stared at that cross and tried to imagine who I was before I came here. Who would have looked at that boy and felt something human? Who would have run toward him with food instead of a rifle? That version of me felt unreachable now, like a person I'd once known but had since buried. I opened my journal again that night, though I hadn't written in days. I tried to write about the boy, but I couldn't start with him. I had to go back further, to the woman screaming after the drone strike, To the old man and his missing son, to the red shoe in the rubble, to the phrases that filled our mouths and erased our memories. No engagement, low impact, intelligence inconclusive. These weren't just words. They were weapons, tools we used to kill truth long after the shooting stopped. We were trained to eliminate threats. But somewhere along the way, we'd learned to eliminate guilt, too. That's when it really hit me. The war wasn't just fought in villages and valleys. It was fought in our language, in our reports, in the things we chose not to see. The way we rewrote events to fit the mission narrative. The way we left people behind and never said their names again. The way we told ourselves over and over that we were doing good when the evidence screamed otherwise. The real casualty, the first and most permanent one, wasn't flesh and blood, it was the truth. And each time we filed another clean, redacted, sterilized version of what really happened, we weren't just lying to command. We were erasing ourselves. And yet, we kept going. Because that's what war does. It doesn't just destroy villages. It devours memory. It rewires conscience. It teaches you to live with things you never thought you could live with. And worst of all, it rewards you for it. You get commendations, medals, praise, all while carrying a silence so loud it echoes even when you sleep. So I wrote one last sentence that night, scrawled across the bottom of the page in handwriting I barely recognized. We used to carry truth. Now we just carry guns and excuses. Then I closed the journal and stared into the darkness, knowing that someday I'd have to find a way to live with what I didn't do, what I didn't say, and who I didn't help. But that night, I was still a soldier. And soldiers don't mourn truth. Not out loud. I didn't know it at the time, but coming home was just another battlefield, one that looked nothing like the ones I'd trained for. There were no sandbags or razor wire, no warning signs or checklists, no IEDs tucked beneath the sidewalk. But there were traps all the same. They were woven into casual conversations, polite smiles, awkward glances from people who didn't know what to say to someone who had been over there. The first few days, everyone seemed to want to say something, but none of it touched anything real. They wanted simple stories, the kind that made them feel good about the country, about me, about the whole ugly business. "We're proud of you," they'd say. "You made a difference." And I'd smile back, nod, say thank you, and lie with my silence. What was I supposed to tell them? That I wasn't sure what we accomplished. That sometimes I didn't even know who we were fighting. That I watched a boy walk toward me with a bowl and felt absolutely nothing. I started drifting. Days blurred together. I'd wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, convinced I was back in the barracks, or worse, in the burnt-out village with the screaming woman and the half-buried shoe. Sometimes I'd forget where I was for minutes at a time. I'd be driving to the grocery store and find myself gripping the steering wheel like it was a trigger, scanning rooftops for snipers, eyes darting to rearview mirrors like someone might tail me. I knew, logically, I was safe. But my body didn't believe it. My brain didn't trust it. And no amount of counseling brochures or "thank you for your service" discounts was going to fix that. The worst moments weren't even the nightmares. It was the still ones. Sitting in a coffee shop, hearing laughter at the next table, and suddenly realizing I didn't belong in the room. I'd look at people talking about sales or sports or TV shows and wonder how they could care about anything so small. I'd see fathers laughing with their children and feel this awful twist of jealousy and guilt, not because I hated them, but because I remembered how I once believed I'd come home and pick up where I left off. That I'd just slot back into my old life like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Me. And the more I tried to explain it, the more I realized how deep the gap had grown. I remember trying once, sitting with an old friend at a bar, both of us nursing beers, and he asked me, what was the worst part? I stared at the amber liquid in my glass for a long time before answering. I didn't talk about the firefights or the bodies or the time we found an entire family hiding in a basement after a raid we were told had no civilian presence. I told him about a report I had to write. A 2-page summary of an aid mission where everything went smoothly. I told him how I wrote that report after watching an old man beg for his son's life. After seeing a group of children playing a game where they took turns pretending to die from gunshots. I told him how I sat down that night and stared at a blank screen for 30 minutes before typing the words, "No incident occurred. Supplies delivered." That was the worst part. Because I knew, as I typed it, that I was killing something real, something painful, something true. He didn't know what to say. He looked down, nodded, and changed the subject. I don't blame him. No one really wants to know what war does to the soul. They just want the bullet points. The summary. A movie version with a clean third act and a triumphant ending. But the war didn't end when I flew home. If anything, it grew sharper in the absence of gunfire. Over there, I was surrounded by people who understood. We didn't have to talk about it, we just knew. Over here, I felt like I'd smuggled something across the border, something heavy and sharp that no one could see but that I couldn't put down. And the world around me moved on so effortlessly, like it had been waiting for me to stop interrupting it. I avoided the VA for months. I told myself I didn't need help, that I was fine. But I wasn't. The war followed me into every room, into every dream, into every silence. And the longer I avoided it, the louder it got. Until finally, one night, I opened my journal again. I hadn't touched it since that last entry about truth and silence. I flipped through the pages and read my own handwriting like it belonged to someone else, a younger man, a man still wrestling with what was right and what was real. There were pages soaked in sweat, one page with a brown smear that might have been blood, and another where the ink had bled from where I'd cried without realizing it. And buried near the back was a passage I'd written months ago. One I had forgotten entirely. There are moments in war when you realize the battle isn't about territory or politics. It's about whether you can hold on to your humanity. Whether you can still see faces instead of threats. Whether you can feel something, anything, when a child walks toward you. If you lose that, you've already lost, no matter who wins. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I closed the book, got up, and walked outside. It was cold. The street was empty. The stars were out. And for the first time in months, I let myself feel it. All of it. The grease. The guilt. The anger. The doubt. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my own home, a veteran of a war most people had already forgotten, and I let the truth wash over me like a flood. We hadn't lost our souls in firefights or airstrikes. We'd lost them in paperwork, in silence, in the polite lies we told to keep things moving. We'd let the truth die so we could come home and sleep at night, so the world could watch clean news segments and believe in simple victories. But I couldn't unsee what I saw. Couldn't unread what I'd written. Couldn't unfeel what I had failed to feel at the time. And in that moment, under the stars, alone in a quiet neighborhood thousands of miles from the ashes of that village, I realized I had a choice. I could let the truth stay buried. Or I could carry it, broken and bloody, back into the light. Not to punish. Not to blame. But to remember. Because the truth deserved to be remembered. Even if I was the only one left to do it. I wish I could tell you that writing those letters fixed something. That the weight I'd been dragging through my soul began to lift. That the truth, once acknowledged, brought with it some kind of peace. But it didn't. Not really. What it brought was clarity, a terrible, unflinching clarity that didn't soothe, but instead sharpened every memory I'd tried to bury. And with that clarity came a question I couldn't answer. What do you do with the truth when no one wants to hear it? I wrote during the nights mostly, because sleep no longer came easy. There was something about the stillness between midnight and dawn that felt honest. The world was quieter. There was no traffic outside my window, no idle conversations from passing strangers, no cheerful distractions humming from televisions. Just the soft creak of my chair, the scratching of my pen, and the ghosts of 100 moments I'd tried so hard to silence. They sat with me, sometimes just out of sight. The boy with the ball. The old man searching for his son. The shoe. The rubble. The drone strike. Aerith, our translator, who never made it home. Faces with names I remember, and names I never knew. Their presence was constant now, not to haunt, but to remind. I had become a custodian of truths discarded by convenience. A keeper of what didn't make it into the official narratives. And I began to realize something that unnerved me more than anything I'd seen in the field. We weren't just soldiers in a physical war, we were instruments in a war against memory. A campaign of selective forgetting, where anything too complex, too human, too morally gray was quietly set aside in favor of something simpler, neater, and easier to swallow. And in that war, I had played my part well. I had checked the boxes, filed the reports, bit my tongue, nodded when I was supposed to, and in doing so, I had helped erase entire lives from the record. It started to eat at me. I remember going to a dinner party once, a few months after returning. A friend from college had invited me. I didn't want to go, crowds still made me feel cornered, but I forced myself. I sat there at a long table, surrounded by laughter and wine glasses, listening to people talk about promotions and yoga and weekend plans. Eventually, someone asked me about the war. Just one word, so. It was such a small word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 assumptions. So, did you do your job? So, was it worth it? So, did you see things you can't forget? So, did you kill? So, are you proud? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What could I say? That depends, I said finally. Do you want the version that makes you feel better, or the one that might keep you up at night? They laughed, uncomfortably. Someone changed the subject. And just like that, I understood, most people don't want the truth. Not really. They want a shape of it. Something palatable. A version with clean lines and uplifting endings. They want movies. Heroes. Symbols. Not contradictions. Not reality soaked in dust and blood and the quiet horror of complicity. So I stopped talking about it. But I didn't stop writing. My journal became a kind of confessional. Not just for what I'd done, but for what I hadn't done. For the things I'd witnessed and let slide. For the orders I followed without question. For the moments I hesitated and the moments I didn't. I wrote about the villagers we cleared out with threats and loudspeakers. About the time we found a man beaten half to death by a rival militia and were told to stay out of it. About the girl who approached our convoy screaming something in Pashto I didn't understand, until one of our guys said she was asking if we'd seen her baby. And we hadn't. But we knew what that usually meant. And most of all, I wrote about the lies. Not the big, dramatic ones. Not the kind shouted on podiums. The little ones. The ones we told ourselves to keep going. We're doing good. We're protecting freedom. They hate us because of our values. If we hadn't done it, someone worse would have. Each one a brick in the wall we built between ourselves and the truth. Eventually, I started reading those entries aloud. Not to anyone. Just to the silence. Just to hear the words spoken. I think I needed to convince myself that they were real. That the truth I carried hadn't been completely lost to the tides of denial and official statements. I thought about publishing them. Turning the journal into a book. Maybe anonymously. But then I pictured the backlash. The criticism. The dismissal. He's just bitter. He's making it up. He's dishonoring the uniform. I'd seen what happened to other veterans who tried to speak up. Their loyalty questioned. Their sanity doubted. And worse, their stories reduced to noise in the endless churn of information no one listens to anymore. So I held on to the journal. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized that sometimes truth isn't meant to be broadcast. Sometimes it's meant to be carried. Carefully. Personally. Like a flame you protect from the wind. There was one night, late autumn, when I went back to the edge of town where the fields stretch out like open hands. It was the kind of place where the stars could still be seen clearly and the air smelled like earth and memory. I brought the journal with me. I sat on the hood of my car, lit a cigarette, and opened to a random page. It was the entry about the market district, about the boy with the backpack. I remembered every second of that day, the way his feet moved, the shape of his shoulders, the moment he turned the corner and vanished forever. I remembered writing that report afterward. Remembered the words I chose: suspected courier. No civilian casualties. Area secured. But the truth? He had freckles. I didn't write that in the report. He had this tiny cut on his lip, like he'd bitten it. He looked back once. I didn't write that either, because that wasn't mission relevant. I closed the journal. I looked up at the stars. And I thought, he deserves to be remembered for more than the threat he might have been. He deserves to be remembered as a boy. And that's when I understood, truly, finally, that my mission hadn't ended when I left the war. It had only changed. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a witness. And maybe that was just as important. Maybe not louder, not more glamorous, but necessary. Because the world runs on stories. And if we don't tell the real ones, someone else will tell them for us. And they'll be wrong. There's something peculiar that happens when you spend enough time alone with the truth. It stops feeling like a burden and starts to become a kind of companion. A ghost, yes, but not one that haunts in the traditional sense. It doesn't shriek or rattle chains. It just sits with you, quietly, like an old friend who's seen everything you've seen and doesn't need you to explain yourself. And that's what the truth became for me, something I couldn't run from anymore, but also something I no longer wanted to. It was all I had that felt real. The journal pages multiplied. My small, cluttered desk turned into a shrine of recollection: spiral notebooks, legal pads, printed maps, old letters, even crumpled photos that I had once tried to destroy but couldn't bring myself to. One showed Arif standing in the sun, smiling awkwardly at the camera. We'd just handed out school supplies to a group of kids, part of a hearts and minds operation meant more for our conscience than for them. I remember how forced the whole thing felt, how we posed with the kids, gave them notebooks and pencils like we were saviors, then loaded back into the Humvees and left before sundown because the area became too dangerous after dark. But Arif stayed a few minutes longer, talking with a local shopkeeper, asking about water shortages, food rations. That was the last photo I ever took of him. He was dead 2 weeks later. Shot by someone who used to be our ally. And in the official report, one line: translator killed in the line of duty. Circumstances unknown. Unknown. That word made me sick. We knew exactly what happened. We'd known something was wrong for days. The tension in that village had been growing, a new militia had started making threats, and we were ordered to de-escalate through presence, which is military speak for show up with guns and hope they don't test you. Arif had told us, warned us. But no one listened. Because he wasn't on the payroll the same way we were. He was just local support. Disposable. Replaceable. And when he was gone, no one mourned him beyond the half-hearted salute. His death was a logistical inconvenience. We got a new translator a week later. Never even knew his name. That reality hit me harder the more I wrote. For every name I remembered, there were 5 I didn't. People whose lives we crossed like shadows, villagers, farmers, merchants, children, and in many cases, we didn't even ask their names. We didn't have time. Or we were told not to. Keep interactions minimal. Don't get attached. That was the mantra. Because once you put a name to someone, you stop seeing them as part of the mission and start seeing them as human, and humanity has no place in a theater of war. It complicates the chain of command. It asks too many questions. It demands too much empathy. But that's exactly why I kept writing, because they deserve names. They deserve more than the word collateral. They deserve more than a drone image in grayscale with a red X on the roof. They were people, and we turned them into footnotes. I remember another moment, one I had tried to forget for years. It was during a joint operation with a NATO unit. We were tasked with clearing a suspected weapons cache from a compound outside a rural town. Intel had come from a confidential informant. We'd heard that phrase before. It usually meant someone desperate enough to say anything for a few dollars and a promise of protection we couldn't always guarantee. But we went in anyway, midday, boots pounding the dry earth, eyes scanning rooftops, fingers resting lightly on triggers. When we reached the compound, it was already half empty. The family had fled. All except for one woman, maybe in her 50s, who stood in the courtyard, shaking. Not with rage. With terror. She kept pointing to a shed, speaking rapidly in Pashto. Our interpreter wasn't fluent. We thought she was warning us, maybe there were explosives, traps. So we followed protocol. We detained her. Searched the shed. There were no weapons. Just bags of grain. A broken radio. A bicycle. And in the back corner, beneath a tattered blanket, a small child no older than 5, curled up and sobbing. The confidential informant had lied. But we didn't put that in the report. The report said, area cleared. Negative on weapons. Woman detained for questioning. That was it. 1 teragrass. It left out the screaming. It left out the boy's eyes. It left out how one of our guys punched a wall in frustration after realizing we just terrorized a family over bad intel. It left out how we left them there was nothing, not even an apology. I wrote that report. And I signed it. I told myself it was just procedure. Just paperwork. But the truth? It was a eulogy. For our integrity. For the idea that we were still the good guys. That was the moment I realized how much truth we were trained to amputate. Not deny outright, just shave off at the edges, polish the language, soften the blow. And when you do that enough times, you don't just lie to others, you lie to yourself. You start believing the story because the real one is too painful to live with. And I think that's what changed me. Not the war itself, but the narrative that followed. The story we were told to tell. The way our superiors smiled in front of cameras and spoke about noble sacrifice and strategic objectives while we sat in tents reading casualty numbers like weather reports. The way people back home asked me if I got any bad guys, as if that question had an answer that didn't cost someone their soul. Eventually, even my family stopped asking questions. Not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid of what I might say. And I don't blame them. The truth is ugly, messy, inconvenient. It doesn't make good television. It doesn't make you feel patriotic. It reminds you that your tax dollars helped pay for the bullet that missed its target and hit a bedroom wall. It reminds you that freedom isn't always the gift we think it is when it's dropped from 30,000 feet. It reminds you that sometimes we leave places worse than we found them. So I wrote. And I remembered. And I grieved, not just for the dead, but for the truth we sacrificed to keep the lie alive. The lie that it was all worth it, that it was clean, that it was justified. But the longer I sat with my ghost, my quiet companion of memory, the more I understood that telling the truth, even if no one listens, is still an act of rebellion, of healing, of redemption. Maybe I couldn't undo the past. Maybe I couldn't bring Eros back, or apologize to the woman in the courtyard, or tell the little girl who said ashes that someone still thinks of her every single day. But I could write their names. I could refuse to let them disappear. I could let the truth breathe, even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. Because the world might not want it. But someone has to carry it. I carried Daniel's letter around in my pocket for days like it was a talisman, folded and refolded until the creases began to tear, until the ink began to blur. I must have read those few lines 100 times, sitting in parking lots, at red lights, on my porch when the air was still and the sun bled into the trees. It wasn't just what he said, it was what he didn't say. The silences between the words. The way he admitted to remembering things he hadn't known he'd forgotten. That phrase haunted me because it named something I'd been feeling for years. This slow, corrosive disintegration of memory, not because I wanted to forget, but because the world around me demanded it. And that's the part that no one talks about. The forgetting isn't a passive thing. It's expected, required, baked into the return. They greet you at the airport with flags and cameras and handshakes, and somewhere between the gate and the ride home, the clock starts ticking. How long before you laugh again? How long before you say you're doing good? How long before you fit back into the life you left behind like a piece that never cracked? And if you don't, well, then you're broken. That's the word they use when a soldier won't forget. When he refuses to forget. When he sits too long in silence, or flinches at sudden noises, or brings up things that make the dinner table uncomfortable. They call him broken, as if he's a machine that no longer serves its purpose. But I wasn't broken. I was remembering. And that act, that stubborn insistence on remembering, is more dangerous to the system than any enemy I ever faced in the field. After Daniel's letter, something shifted in me. The solitude that once felt like safety began to feel like surrender. I'd spent so long hiding from the world, telling myself I was protecting others from the weight of my truth, but really, I was protecting myself from the judgment I feared would follow. The raised eyebrows, the polite nods, the sudden discomfort. But Daniel reminded me that the truth has power, even if it's whispered. Even if it's only shared between two people scarred by the same silence. So I started printing more copies of the journal. Not for sale. For giving. One copy I slipped into the mailbox of Arif's younger brother. I had tracked him down through a veteran support contact. He was working at a university in Chicago, studying law. I wrote a short note and tucked it inside. Your brother saved more lives than I ever did. He should have been remembered better. I hope this helps. I never heard back. But that wasn't the point. Another copy I gave to the mother of a young private who died in an IED blast on his first deployment. She had reached out years ago, just after the funeral, asking if I could tell her what really happened. Back then, I gave her the official version, clean, respectful, just vague enough to spare her the details. But I never stopped thinking about her. About how hollow my words must have felt. About how truth, even when it hurts, is often more comforting than kindness wrapped in lies. This time, I gave her the real story. And when she called me, voice shaking, words coming slow, I thought she was going to scream at me. But instead, she said, "Thank you." I knew it wasn't how they said. I just wanted to know my son didn't die for nothing. I didn't have the heart to tell her that, sometimes, nothing is all there is. That the mission that day was scrubbed. That the intelligence had been faulty. That her son died in a convoy that had no real destination. But I did tell her he died with bravery. That he helped pull another man from a burning vehicle just minutes before the second blast hit. That he said his mother's name before he lost consciousness. That part was true. And she wept. And I listened. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a liar. It wasn't long after that when I was asked to speak at a local high school, Veterans Appreciation Day or something like that. A teacher friend of mine had arranged it. I almost said no. What would I say? What could I say to a room full of teenagers who had grown up on video games and war movies and YouTube clips of missile strikes? What would they understand about the cost of watching a man bleed out while calling for a medic who wouldn't make it in time? But I said yes. And when I stood before them in that stale gymnasium, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I didn't tell them the usual story. I didn't talk about bravery or honor or patriotism. I didn't talk about the flag or freedom or what it means to serve. I talked about Eris. I talked about the woman in the courtyard. I talked about the little girl who said ashes and about the boy with the bowl who just wanted food. I told them war is not what you think it is. I told them war is boredom punctuated by terror. It is sand in your teeth, blood in your boots, and the smell of burnt metal that never quite washes off. It is the confusion of orders that don't make sense, the frustration of watching civilians pay the price for decisions made by people thousands of miles away. And I told them the hardest thing I had ever learned. That in war, truth is the first thing to die. Not men. Not missions. Truth. Because the truth makes war harder to sell. It makes recruitment more difficult. It makes policies harder to justify. It makes the medal ceremonies feel hollow. It makes the press briefings falter. And so we bury it. We spin it. We wrap it in ribbon and call it valor. But real truth? It's messy. It's grief-soaked. It's human. And if you want to honor a veteran, I said, don't just thank them. Ask them what they remember. And listen, even if it makes you uncomfortable. By the time I finished, the gym was silent. Not the awkward kind. The sacred kind. A few kids clapped. One girl cried. And later, a teacher told me it was the most honest talk they'd ever heard. I went home that night, sat at my desk, and opened the journal again. There was one blank page left. And for the first time in all those years, I knew exactly how to end it. So I wrote, some things can't be made right, but they can be remembered. And sometimes, that's all the justice we get. Then I closed the journal, not with finality, but with reverence. Because the story didn't end there. It never really does. Sometimes, late at night when the streets are empty and the world has gone still, I walk. No destination. No purpose. Just me and the dark, moving in rhythm with my thoughts. Street lamps flicker above like stars blurred by time. A breeze rustles through leaves, and every once in a while, a car passes, its headlights sweeping across the pavement like searchlights. I walk because it's the only time I feel close to something I've lost, closer to those long desert roads, to the silence between firefights, to the clarity that came only when everything else had been stripped away. And in those moments, I find myself whispering the names of people no one else remembers. A small act, maybe. But in war, memory becomes sacred. And in peace, remembrance becomes rebellion. The world moves on so quickly. That's something they don't prepare you for. You come home thinking everything has changed, because you have. But it hasn't. People are still arguing over coffee orders in traffic. Politicians are still selling hope like cheap cologne, and the news is just another slideshow of pain repackaged between commercials for cars and fast food. And yet, you can't look away. Because part of you still thinks that maybe, buried under the spin and the slogans, someone will finally say it. Someone will finally stand up and tell the truth about what we did, about what it cost. But they don't. They never do. So it's left to us. To those of us who can't sleep without hearing echoes. To those who see a rusted pipe and remember the barrel of a rifle. To those who walk through crowds with a soldier's gaze, watching hands, scanning exits, measuring distance like a survival instinct engraved in the bones. We are the keepers now. The unwilling archivists of a history too raw for textbooks. Not heroes. Not victims. Just men and women trying to make sense of the things we saw and the things we did to survive them. And it isn't just about the bullets. It's about what the bullets missed. Like the boy in Kandahar whose father used to carve little wooden birds to sell to passing convoys. I bought one once. Kept it in my breast pocket like a charm. One day the father stopped showing up. No one ever said why. But the boy still came, his face smudged with dust, his hands too small for war. He gave me another bird, smaller than the first. When I asked him why, he just smiled and said, "So you don't forget." I carried that second bird through 5 deployments. It sits now on my nightstand, next to a stack of letters I never sent. I look at it when I can't sleep, and I whisper, "I haven't forgotten. I never will." That's what they don't understand. The war ends, yes, but the remembering never does. It stays in your breath, in your pauses, in the way you hesitate before answering simple questions. It lives in the gaps between words. In the way you can't quite bring yourself to say, "fine," when someone asks how you're doing. Because fine doesn't cover the dream where your friend's last scream becomes your alarm clock. Fine doesn't explain why you flinch when fireworks go off in July. Fine doesn't explain why you freeze when you hear a language you used to hear through radio static and gunfire. No, the truth is not fine. It's jagged. It's inconvenient. It doesn't play well on TV. It won't fit into a 30-second soundbite or a politician's speech. And that's why it had to die first. Because once truth dies, the rest becomes easier. Easier to wage. Easier to justify. Easier to forget. But here's the thing they didn't count on. Truth may be the first casualty, but it's also the hardest to bury. It keeps clawing its way out of shallow graves. It survives in fragments. In stories. In scars. In people like me. I once believed, with everything in me, that we were doing the right thing. That our presence mattered. That we were bringing safety, order, freedom. I recited the briefings. I believed the maps. I saluted the mission. And then I saw what the mission did. Not in theory, in blood. In missing limbs and burning homes and the quiet resignation in the eyes of families who had seen 100 men like me come and go, all promising the same peace that never came. I'm not angry at the men I served with. We did what we were trained to do. We followed orders. We adapted. We endured. But now, with years behind me and silence all around me, I see the larger betrayal. The one that came not from the battlefield, but from above. From those who knew and never told us. From those who turned strategy into theater. From those who used words like precision and liberation in collateral to dress up horror in suits and ties. They didn't just lie to the public. They lied to us. And we believed them. So what now? I won't pretend I have answers. But I know this, I will not forget. I will not lie. I will not simplify. When someone asks me what war is, I will tell them about the translator who died unnamed. About the child with the bowl. About the convoy that fired too soon. About the medals handed out in rooms where no one mentioned the family caught in the blast radius. About the guilt. The sear. The numbness. And the slow, agonizing return to a world that doesn't want to hear any of it. And when I'm asked, why write it down? Why remember what hurt so much? I say this. Because someone has to. Because forgetting is the final death. Because memory, however painful, is the only way we keep the truth alive. And if truth is the first casualty in war, then remembrance is the first act of peace. So I will remember. I will remember them all. The ones who came back in pieces. The ones who didn't come back at all. The ones who were never counted. The ones we couldn't save. The ones we harmed. The ones who looked at us and saw not soldiers, but ghosts, arriving with guns and leaving with excuses. I will remember them even when no one else does. Especially then. Because when the smoke clears, and the noise fades, and the flags are lowered, that's what's left. Not victory. Not pride. Not closure. Just truth. And I will not let it die again.